Nobody could explain how an aging retired canine found help in the middle of a stormy wilderness, but without him, a Navy SEAL would never have made it home. It is 2:13 in the morning, and the mountains of western Montana are swallowed by darkness. A cold rain drifts through the pine trees, turning narrow trails into ribbons of mud and shadow. The scent of wet earth hangs heavy in the air. Wind pushes through the forest in long mournful breaths, rattling branches high above the valley floor. Somewhere beneath that endless canopy of black, Michael Carter lies motionless beside a rocky slope. His flashlight has long since gone dark. His backpack rests several feet away. Rainwater beads across his jacket and trickles down his face. At 42 years old, Michael has endured years of military training, deployments, and challenges that most people could scarcely imagine, but tonight none of that matters. The mountains do not care who he used to be. They do not care about medals, service records, or the gold trident tucked inside the pocket of his jacket. In the darkness, he is simply one man alone. And beside him stands a German shepherd no one wanted. Rex's sable coat is soaked from hours in the rain. Water drips from the gray fur around his muzzle. At 9 years old, his body carries the quiet marks of time. His joints ache in the cold. His movements are slower than they once were. The shelter workers had called him too old. Too retired. Too much responsibility. Families passed his kennel without stopping. Some barely looked at him. Yet now, under the storm-dark sky, the old dog refuses to leave. His amber eyes move between Michael and the forest beyond. His ears twitch toward distant sounds hidden inside the rain. He nudges Michael's shoulder once. Then again. No response. A low whine escapes his throat. Not fear. Not panic. Determination. The kind that cannot be trained. The kind that lives somewhere deeper. For a moment Rex stands perfectly still. Wind moves through the pines. Thunder rolls far beyond the ridgeline. Then the old K9 makes a decision. He turns away from the only person who ever gave him a second chance and disappears into the darkness. Through rain. Through mud. Through miles of wilderness. Running towards something only he seems to understand. Back at the mountainside, Michael remains alone beneath the storm clouds. Minutes pass. Then more. The forest grows quieter. Colder. The night seems endless. Until, somewhere in the distance, a faint light appears between the trees. Then another. And another. Voices echo through the darkness. Searchlights sweep across the mountainside. Boots crunch against wet gravel. Nobody understands how help found its way there. Nobody understands how an aging retired K9 crossed those miles alone. But before sunrise, everyone will be talking about the dog nobody wanted. 6 months earlier, spring sunlight spilled across the foothills outside Bozeman, painting the grass in shades of gold and green. The storm, the mountains, and the searchlights were still far in the future. On that quiet afternoon, Rex sat alone in the last kennel on the right side of the adoption center. A small card hung on the chain-link gate. His name. His age. A few simple notes about his service history. Most visitors never read past the number 9. Children stopped in front of younger dogs with bright eyes and endless energy. Couples pointed toward playful puppies tumbling across the exercise yard. Families smiled, laughed, and walked away with new companions. Rex remained where he was. Calm. Silent. Watching. The scent of fresh-cut grass drifted through the open windows. Somewhere beyond the kennels, wind chimes rattled softly against a wooden porch. A volunteer named Karen paused outside his enclosure and crouched beside the gate. "You are a good boy," she whispered. Rex slowly wagged his tail. Karen smiled, but there was sadness behind it. She had said those same words dozens of times. Good dogs did not always get chosen. Especially older ones. especially working dogs carrying invisible scars from years of service. Across the room, another family arrived. A father. A mother. Two excited children. Karen stood and greeted them warmly. Within minutes they were laughing beside a young Labrador mix. Rex watched quietly from the corner of his kennel. He did not bark. He did not compete for attention. Experience had taught him patience. By late afternoon the center grew quiet again. Sunlight stretched longer across the concrete floor. Shadows gathered along the walls. One by one, the remaining visitors left. Rex lowered himself onto his blanket. Another day. Another disappointment. Then the front door opened once more. The sound was ordinary. Yet something made Rex lift his head. A man stepped inside wearing faded jeans, hiking boots, and a weathered brown jacket. He stood taller than most people in the room. Broad shoulders. Short light brown hair touched with gray. His face carried the stillness of someone accustomed to long periods of silence. Michael Carter had not come looking for a dog. In truth, he had spent months avoiding anything that might create another emotional attachment. Loss had already taken enough from him. The small cabin he called home felt empty, but it felt safe. Safe meant predictable. Predictable meant no more heartbreak. He approached the front desk with a simple intention. Make a donation. Shake a few hands. Leave. Yet before he reached the counter, he felt something. Not a sound. Not a voice. A feeling. As if someone across the room was studying him. Michael turned his head. At the far end of the kennel row, an aging German shepherd stood perfectly still behind a chain-link gate. Their eyes met. Neither moved. Around them, the room seemed to fall strangely quiet. And for reasons Michael could not explain, he found himself walking toward the last kennel on the right. Michael stopped a few feet from the kennel and rested his hand against the cool metal fence. Rex remained standing, his amber eyes fixed on the stranger. Around them, the shelter settled into the quiet rhythm of late afternoon. A distant vacuum hummed somewhere in the back offices. Papers shuffled behind the front desk. Outside, a breeze stirred the cottonwood trees, carrying the scent of sun-warmed grass through an open window. Yet neither man nor dog seemed to notice any of it. For several seconds they simply looked at one another. Karen approached with a gentle smile. His name is Rex, she said softly. Retired working dog. Very well trained. Very calm. Michael glanced at the information card attached to the gate. 9 years old. German Shepherd. Former K9. The words were simple, but something about them lingered. How long has he been here? Michael asked. Karen hesitated before answering. Almost 8 months. Michael looked back at the dog. 8 months felt like a long time for any animal waiting to be chosen. Rex slowly stepped closer. Not excited. Not desperate. Just curious. His movements carried a quiet dignity that reminded Michael of people he once served beside. Men who had spent years doing difficult jobs without expecting recognition. Men who understood duty. Karen opened the kennel gate. Would you like to meet him? She asked. Michael had intended to stay for only a few minutes. He had promised himself that much before driving to the shelter. No commitments. No emotional decisions. No attempts to fill the silence that waited for him every evening inside his cabin. Yet somehow he heard himself say, sure. Rex walked out carefully and stopped in front of him. The old dog lifted his nose slightly, taking in the scent of worn leather, pine sap, campfire smoke, and mountain air. Michael crouched slowly. His knees cracked softly as he lowered himself. For a moment he wondered whether the dog would walk away. Instead, Rex sat down directly in front of him. Calm. Steady. Present. Michael extended a hand. Rex leaned forward and touched it with his nose. The contact lasted only a second, but something shifted. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. A deployment years earlier. A military working dog sitting beside a helicopter before dawn. Silent. Alert. Faithful. The kind of partner who never asked questions and never abandoned his team. Michael swallowed hard. Karen noticed the change in his expression. "He is a good dog," she said. "The problem is people see his age before they see him." Michael looked at the gray fur beginning to spread across Rex's muzzle. He understood that feeling better than he cared to admit. Many people saw age. Others saw old wounds. Some only saw what had been lost. Few bothered to notice what remained. Rex slowly rested his head against Michael's knee. It was a small gesture. Simple. Trusting. Yet it carried a weight neither of them could explain. And for the first time in a very long while, the empty cabin waiting beyond the mountains felt a little less empty. The adoption paperwork took less than 30 minutes. The decision itself seemed to take even less. Karen reviewed the forms one final time while Michael signed his name across the bottom page. Outside the shelter windows, the afternoon sun drifted lower toward the mountains, casting long golden shadows across the parking lot. "You know," Karen said carefully, "most people ask to meet 3 or 4 dogs before deciding." Michael glanced toward Rex, who lay quietly near the door with the patience of someone who had spent a lifetime waiting. "I only needed to meet one." Karen smiled, though surprise still lingered in her eyes. Before they left, another volunteer approached carrying a worn leather collar and a small canvas pouch. "These came with him," she explained. "His service records are inside." Michael accepted them gently. The leather felt weathered from years of use. Scratches marked the surface. Time had softened the edges. Somehow it felt less like equipment and more like a piece of history. Rex rose to his feet the moment Michael picked up the leash. Not excited. Not frantic. Simply ready. As if he had been preparing for this moment for months. The drive home stretched nearly 2 hours west through rolling valleys and open ranch country. Snow still clung to distant mountain peaks despite the warmth of spring. Fence posts flashed past the truck windows in steady rhythm. For most of the drive, neither of them made a sound. Rex sat upright in the passenger seat, watching the landscape unfold beyond the glass. Occasionally his ears twitched toward a passing truck or distant train horn. Michael found himself glancing over every few minutes. Not because he was worried. Because the presence beside him felt strangely familiar. The cabin appeared near sunset, tucked against a pine-covered hillside overlooking a narrow river valley. Weathered cedar boards covered the exterior. A small porch wrapped around the front. Wind chimes swayed gently near the entrance, filling the evening air with soft metallic notes. Michael parked the truck and stepped out. Cool mountain air carried the scent of pine needles and melting snow. For a moment Rex remained seated inside the vehicle. His amber eyes studied the property carefully. The trees. The porch. The distant ridgeline. Every detail mattered. Then he climbed down and slowly crossed the gravel driveway. His paws crunched softly against the stones. Michael unlocked the front door and stepped aside. "Well," he said quietly, "this is home." Rex paused at the threshold. The cabin stood silent beyond the doorway. A living room. A stone fireplace. A worn recliner facing the windows. The kind of place where memories lingered long after voices disappeared. The old German shepherd took one cautious step inside. Then another. He moved through each room without hurry, inspecting corners, hallways, and windows as daylight faded beyond the mountains. Finally he returned to the living room and settled beside the fireplace. Michael watched him for a long moment. Something about the sight eased a weight he had carried for years. The cabin no longer felt empty. Yet neither of them knew that this quiet evening marked the beginning of a bond that would one day be tested far beyond the safety of those walls. The days settled into a rhythm neither of them expected. Morning sunlight spilled across the valley through curtains of mist that rose from the river below. Michael woke before dawn most days, carrying a mug of coffee onto the porch while the mountains slowly emerged from darkness. Without fail, Rex was already there. Sometimes he sat at the edge of the deck watching deer move through the trees. Other times he simply rested beside the old wooden steps, ears alert to sounds only he seemed to notice. Weeks passed. Spring deepened across the valley. Wildflowers appeared along the hiking trails. Snow retreated farther up the mountainsides. Little by little, the silence inside the cabin began to change. It was still quiet, but it no longer felt lonely. Rex developed habits that made Michael smile despite himself. Every evening the old dog completed the same careful inspection of the property. He checked the porch, the tool shed, the tree line beyond the gravel driveway. Then he returned to the front door as if reporting that everything remained exactly as it should be. Michael often watched from the window, shaking his head. "You know you are retired, right?" he would say. Rex never seemed convinced. Yet beneath the peaceful routine, both carried burdens they rarely revealed. Some nights Michael woke suddenly from uneasy dreams. The cabin remained dark except for moonlight stretching across the floorboards. During those moments he would sit quietly on the edge of the bed, staring into the shadows while old memories drifted through his mind like distant echoes. He never spoke about them. There was no one to tell. At least that was what he believed. Each time it happened, Rex appeared. Sometimes the German shepherd simply rested his head against Michael's leg. Sometimes he lay across the bedroom doorway, silent and watchful. He never demanded attention. He only stayed. Somehow that was enough. One rainy evening, Michael opened the canvas pouch that had come from the shelter. The scent of old paper and worn leather filled the room. Inside were service records, photographs, and notes from years of work. He spent hours reading beneath the warm glow of a table lamp while rain tapped gently against the windows. Rex slept beside the fireplace. The records told a story of dedication, discipline, and loyalty. Search operations. Disaster response missions. Long deployments. Years spent protecting people who would never know his name. Michael looked up from the papers and studied the sleeping dog. Gray fur framed Rex's muzzle now. Age had slowed him. Yet the quiet strength remained. "You have seen a lot too, haven't you?" he whispered. Rex opened one eye briefly before settling back to sleep. Outside, thunder rolled softly beyond the mountains. Inside, the fire crackled against the stone hearth. It felt like an ordinary night. A peaceful night. But neither of them noticed the first small sign that something unusual was beginning. For several days now, Rex had become strangely attentive whenever Michael prepared for longer hikes into the backcountry. And each time he watched, the old dog seemed less interested in the trail ahead than in something waiting far beyond it. Summer arrived slowly in the Montana mountains. The mornings came earlier now, filling the valley with pale gold light before 6 o'clock. Birds nested along the riverbanks. Wild grasses swayed across open meadows. On most days, Michael and Rex followed the same familiar routine. Breakfast on the porch. A long walk through the pines. Quiet evenings beside the fireplace. Yet something about the old German shepherd had changed. It began with small things. Whenever Michael unfolded a trail map across the kitchen table, Rex would immediately lift his head. If hiking boots appeared near the front door, the dog stopped whatever he was doing and watched closely. Sometimes he would pace toward the window overlooking the mountains, then return to Michael as if trying to communicate something important. At first, Michael dismissed it as instinct. Working dogs often noticed patterns. Rex had spent years anticipating missions and preparing for assignments. Old habits were difficult to forget. But as the weeks passed, the behavior became harder to ignore. One Saturday morning, Michael packed supplies for a solo trip into a remote section of forest nearly 12 miles from the cabin. The route followed an old fire lookout trail that climbed toward higher elevations before disappearing into rugged backcountry. The weather forecast looked favorable. Clear skies. Mild temperatures. Little chance of rain. Yet the moment Michael placed the map into his backpack, Rex stood up abruptly. His ears flattened slightly. A low uneasy sound escaped his throat. Michael looked over. "What is it?" he asked. Rex walked to the door and stared outside. Then he returned and nudged Michael's leg. The behavior repeated 3 times. It was unusual enough to leave Michael puzzled. "You do not like this trail?" he asked with a faint smile. Rex simply watched him. That afternoon they hiked together anyway. The trail wound through dense pine forest scented with sap and sun-warmed bark. Butterflies drifted across wildflower patches. A cool breeze moved down from the ridges. Everything seemed perfectly normal. Yet, throughout the hike, Rex remained unusually alert. He paused often. Listened longer. Studied distant slopes with focused attention. Twice he stopped completely and looked back the way they had come. Michael noticed. The former Navy SEAL trusted observation. Small details often mattered. Still, nothing appeared wrong. No storms. No damaged trail sections. No signs of danger. As sunset approached, they returned safely to the cabin. But the strange behavior continued over the following days. Each time hiking equipment appeared, Rex reacted the same way. Watching. Waiting. Listening. As though he sensed something hidden beyond the horizon. Then one evening, while the sun disappeared behind the mountains and shadows stretched across the valley floor, Michael unfolded a new map he had never shown Rex before. It marked a remote ridge nearly 20 miles from home. The moment the paper touched the table, the old German shepherd stood motionless. His amber eyes locked onto the map. And for the first time since arriving at the cabin, genuine concern seemed to appear in them. The following morning arrived bright and clear. Sunlight spilled across the valley, illuminating the peaks beyond the cabin in shades of gold and silver. Nothing about the weather hinted at trouble. The air smelled of pine needles and fresh mountain water. Birds moved through the treetops. Somewhere near the river, a hawk called across the open sky. Michael loaded his backpack before sunrise. Extra water. Emergency supplies. A compass. Trail maps. Years of experience had taught him to prepare carefully, especially when venturing into remote terrain. The ridge marked on the map had interested him for months. Old fire lookout foundations remained there, hidden among high meadows and scattered rock formations. It was the kind of place few people visited anymore. Rex watched every movement from beside the front door. The old German shepherd remained unusually quiet. When Michael reached for the truck keys, Rex immediately stood. His ears tilted forward. His eyes never left Michael's face. "I know," Michael said with a faint smile. "You still do not like this one." Rex stepped closer and nudged the backpack. Not playful. Not curious. Intentional. Michael paused for a moment. Something about the gesture unsettled him. Then he shook his head. The forecast was excellent. The trail conditions had been reported as stable. There was no reason to cancel. An hour later they reached the trailhead. The morning remained calm as they started climbing through dense stands of lodgepole pine. Sunlight filtered between branches, painting shifting patterns across the forest floor. For the first few miles everything felt normal. Yet as the elevation increased, subtle changes appeared. A layer of thin clouds gathered above the western ridges. Wind moved through the trees with greater urgency. The forest seemed quieter than usual. Even the birdsong faded. Rex noticed first. He stopped frequently now. Listening. Watching. Several times he turned toward distant slopes hidden behind the trees. Michael followed his gaze but saw nothing unusual. By early afternoon they reached a narrow section of trail overlooking a steep valley. The view stretched for miles. Mountains rolled toward the horizon beneath gathering clouds. Michael removed his pack and drank from a water bottle while Rex remained standing nearby. The dog looked restless. Uneasy. Then something unexpected happened. A sudden gust swept across the ridge, strong enough to scatter loose pine needles through the air. Michael looked up. Dark clouds were forming far faster than forecast models had predicted. Thunder murmured somewhere beyond the peaks. The change was subtle but undeniable. He checked his watch. Plenty of daylight remained. Plenty of time to return. Yet before he could shoulder his pack, Rex moved. The German shepherd stepped directly in front of the trail. He would not budge. Michael frowned. Rex. The dog remained still. Wind intensified across the ridge. Thunder sounded again, slightly closer now. For the first time all day, Michael felt the faint edge of concern. And deep inside the old K9, something seemed to know that the day was about to change in ways neither of them could yet imagine. Michael studied the old German shepherd standing across the trail. Rain-scented wind swept over the ridge, carrying the sharp smell of distant storms. Dark clouds continued gathering along the western horizon. The change had happened so quickly it felt unnatural. 1 hour earlier the sky had been clear. Now shadows moved across the mountains like a slow gray tide. "Come on, Rex," Michael said gently. "We should head back." The dog did not move. His amber eyes remained fixed on something beyond the trees. A low rumble echoed across the peaks. Not thunder this time. Something deeper. Something carried by the wind. Michael followed Rex's gaze toward the northern slope. At first he saw nothing except pine forest stretching across the mountainside. Then movement caught his attention. A section of trail farther ahead had disappeared beneath a fresh layer of fallen branches and loose earth. It was not dramatic. Not catastrophic. Just enough to make the route uncertain. Michael frowned. He had traveled these mountains for years. Conditions could change quickly. Still, he trusted his ability to navigate difficult terrain. He adjusted his backpack and stepped toward an alternate route that followed a narrow ridge. Rex immediately moved beside him. The old dog remained so close their shoulders nearly touched. They continued for another mile while clouds thickened overhead. The temperature dropped noticeably. Wind pressed against the trees with growing force. Then rain began. At first only a few scattered drops. Within minutes it became a steady curtain of cold mountain rain. Visibility shrank. Distant landmarks faded behind mist. Michael stopped to check his map. Water spotted the paper. The trail markers were becoming difficult to see. "Not ideal," he muttered. Rex stood alert beside him. His ears flicked toward the forest below. Then suddenly he moved. The German shepherd trotted several yards downhill before looking back. Michael remained where he was. Rex repeated the behavior. Forward. Stop. Look back. Wait. It was deliberate. Almost purposeful. Michael hesitated. Every instinct told him to continue following the marked route. Yet something about Rex's certainty gave him pause. Finally he nodded. "All right. Show me." The old dog immediately started down the slope. Through wet pines and narrow clearings they descended toward lower ground. Rain intensified. Thunder rolled closer. Several times Michael lost sight of the trail completely, but Rex never seemed confused. He moved with quiet confidence, choosing each turn without hesitation. Nearly 40 minutes later they reached a sheltered section of forest near a ranger access road Michael had forgotten existed. Relief washed over him. The road offered a direct path back toward the valley. He crouched beside Rex and scratched behind his ears. "Looks like you knew something I did not." The German shepherd leaned briefly into the touch. Then another sound drifted through the rain. A distant crack of thunder followed by the sharp buzz of Michael's emergency weather radio. He pulled it from his backpack and listened. A severe storm warning had just been issued for the higher elevations they had left behind. Michael slowly looked back toward the hidden ridge now swallowed by clouds. And for the first time, he began to wonder whether Rex had been watching more than the weather all along. By the time Michael and Rex reached the cabin, night had settled across the valley. Rain tapped softly against the roof while clouds drifted over the mountains like dark ships crossing a silent sea. The weather radio continued issuing updates. Strong winds. Heavy rain. Hazardous conditions in the higher elevations. Michael stood near the living room window listening to the reports. Several of the areas mentioned were places they had crossed only hours earlier. He glanced down at Rex. The old German shepherd rested near the fireplace, his damp coat drying in the warmth of the flames. For a long moment, Michael simply watched him. "You knew something was wrong, did not you?" he asked quietly. Rex lifted his head but said nothing, only meeting his gaze with those steady amber eyes. The next morning the storm had passed. Sunlight returned to the valley. The world smelled fresh and clean, washed by rain. Michael drove into town for supplies and stopped at a small diner near the highway. Conversations filled the room. Coffee cups clinked against saucers. A television mounted above the counter played local news. As he waited for breakfast, a familiar headline appeared. The reporter spoke about severe overnight weather in the mountains. Several hiking routes had been temporarily closed due to storm damage and fallen debris. One of the trails shown on the screen was the same ridge Michael had planned to explore. He stared at the image in silence. A cold realization settled over him. If they had continued forward instead of turning back, they could have spent hours stranded in dangerous conditions far from help. The waitress noticed his expression. "You okay, honey?" she asked. Michael smiled faintly. "Yeah," he said. "Just thinking about a good friend." When he returned home that afternoon, Rex was waiting on the porch. Tail wagging slowly. Calm as ever. Michael climbed the steps and sat beside him. Wind moved gently through the pine trees. Somewhere down in the valley, the river shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. He reached into his pocket and removed the old leather collar that had come from the shelter months earlier. Carefully, he brushed a thumb across the worn surface. Then he looked at Rex. People would probably say the dog had repaid him. That choosing Rex had somehow led to a remarkable act of loyalty. But sitting there beneath the endless Montana sky, Michael understood the truth was much simpler. Neither of them owed the other anything. One lonely man had given an old dog a home. One old dog had given a lonely man purpose. Somewhere along the way, they had stopped rescuing each other and simply become family. Rex rested his head against Michael's shoulder. The mountains stood quiet around them. The wind chimes stirred softly above the porch. And as the sunlight painted the valley gold, peace settled over both of them like a blessing that had been waiting all along.